So in this video, I'm going to be going through my process on how I turn a house into a HMO. Little bit about me, I've converted around 20 HMOs in the past few years and currently manage over 100 rooms. I'll actually be going through a real life example where I converted a 3-bedroom property into a 5-bedroom HMO in 2021. I'll go through my process of how I understand the rules to make sure the HMO that I am designing is compliant. And then also I will design the HMO to show you what that process looks like. Finally, I'll also share what the conversion costs and final rent figures were for that particular deal. The idea being that I'll take you through the entire process on how I convert the property, from understanding the rules through actually designing the HMO and then evaluating whether the HMO is worth converting or not. And hopefully that should spark some ideas and can be of use. So interested in doing the same for your property. So before we actually start getting into the details, to kind of confirm some simple key definitions. So what exactly is a HMO? Well, a HMO is a property where you have these 3 conditions that must be met. If one of the 3 conditions are met, then it is not a HMO. If 2 out of 3 of the conditions are met, then it is not a HMO. If all 3 of the conditions are met, then it is indeed a HMO. So the 3 conditions are, number 1, 3 or more people living together. Number 2, they make up more than one household. And number 3, that they're sharing some form of communal facilities, whether that's kitchens or bathrooms, or both. So what is actually a household? Very simple. A household is made up of people or a person that is related to each other. And this can include step families and half relatives. A couple is also regarded as a household, even if you're not married. So if you're a couple that hasn't been married, but you've been together, that is also considered as a household. So quick examples of kind of what constitutes a HMO. So if you're 2 friends, yes, you make up more than one household, so you meet the kind of second criteria. And yes, you're sharing kitchen facilities, bathroom facilities, but you do not make up more than 3 people. So here you would not require a HMO license, or this would not be regarded as a HMO. If you have 3 friends, however, there's 3 or more people living together, you make up more than one household because you make up 3 households, and you share communal facilities. So here you would require a HMO license. Finally, if you are a parent and a child, where you have 3 or more people living together and you're sharing communal facilities, you only make up one household because you are related. So this would not be a HMO. So hope that kind of clears up the definitions of what a HMO is. So once we've kind of understood what the HMO is, and let's say we've decided that we want to convert our property into a HMO, or we at least want to try and see if it's possible, we need to first understand what the rule set is. HMOs are a very heavily regulated market, and it's really, really important that you understand what the rules are when you're designing your HMO. So the 2 departments that are super, super key to take into consideration are the licensing department and the planning department. The licensing department, I would say, is more of the easy one. Essentially, if you're not a criminal and you're fit to hold a license, essentially, as long as you follow the rules, you will get the license, and everyone needs to have one. Planning, however, can be quite tricky, and you only really need planning in 2 conditions. So either if you're turning a property into a HMO that is more than 7 people. So if it's less than 7 people, or I should say 6 or less people, then it's just licensing that you need to worry about. The minute you tick over 6, so you go up to 7, then you need planning permission. However, there is also another kind of stipulation where you would need planning permission, and this is if your local council is in or has a Article 4 direction. So this is really, really important. As mentioned before, if you turn your property into a HMO for up to 6 people, you only require licensing, not planning. However, in recent years, local councils have essentially put in restrictions for landlords or property owners, where even if you do want to convert your property into a HMO for up to 6 people, you no longer can do so. Essentially, that's where Article 4 comes in. If your local authority or your local council has an Article 4 area, then regardless of the amount of people that are living in the property, of course it still needs to be above 3, you will require planning permission. Okay, so super important. In the status quo is 6 or less, just licensing. 7 or more, planning. However, some local councils, they don't want to increase the amount of HMOs in the area. They have the right to issue Article 4 directions, which removes the right for us as property owners to turn our property into a HMO, no matter how many people we intend to rent the property out to. What I've done is it might be quite a lot of information here. And so I've kind of created a rules checklist. I'm going to go through this with the live example that I spoke to you guys about. But before that, one thing to note with planning is it's never guaranteed. It's never guaranteed because there are things where licensing is more black and white. Planning, there are things outside of your control. For example, if there is an X level of concentration of HMOs within your street, then no matter how nice of a HMO you create, you're not going to get planning permission. Another thing with planning is you have to wait until you get planning permission to start operating your property as a HMO. So this is minimum of 8 to 13 weeks from application submission. So this could take your architect, depending on time and the size of the project, anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks to actually apply for the HMO. And then on top of that, it would be minimum of 8 to 13 weeks to just get a response. So whereas with licensing, you can start renting as soon as you apply, planning, you have to wait. Now that we understand the two kind of departments, and these two departments run really independent of each other, so it's important to make sure that you understand both rule sets. We need to first understand which rule sets apply to us. So what I like to do is I go through this kind of little HMO rules checklist. If we have a look at the first thing, so for my live example, I had a 3-bedroom house and I turned it into a 5-bed HMO. Now, what would be the checklist? Well, the first thing, if we have a look, is who's my local council? Well, my local council is Brent Council. The next thing is how many tenants do I intend to rent the property out to? Well, as we mentioned, 7 or more requires planning. 6 or less, no planning. Because planning is trickier, then I would rather stick to not requiring planning rather than going through the planning process. So for me, I'm going to go for 6 or less. And then we also need to check if it's an Article 4 area. So regardless of how many tenants I intend to actually house, if Brent Council has an Article 4 direction, then it's pretty much irrelevant. I will need to go through planning before I get a license. Now, when I converted this property in 2021. So in 2021, there was no Article 4 in Brent. And so therefore, I did not need to go to planning. I could just go straight to licensing. Now, I'm just going to do a couple examples on how to find out if your council is in an Article 4 area. So, for example, let's try Havering Council. So Havering Council, Article 4, HMOs, because that's what we care about, because Article 4s can be related to a multiple of planning restrictions. We care about houses in multiple occupation, I should say. So here they've got 2 Article 4 directions. The first is in the following wards, and that came into effect in 2016. And the second one is the entire borough, except the above wards. So essentially, if you click on this direction, yeah. So in Havering, this is kind of the boundary of the borough. Essentially, any property within this borough, if you were to turn the property into a HMO, regardless of how many people you intend to house, so even if it's 4 or even if it's 3, you need to go through planning permission in Havering Council because they have an Article 4 direction. Now, let's take another council. So let's say Harrow Council, Article 4. In Harrow Council, HMO, Article 4. Yeah, and nothing really comes up. So Harrow, so if you were to kind of turn your property into a HMO in Harrow, you can do so without requiring planning permission for up to 6 people. But remember, if you were to apply for 7 or more people in Harrow, then you would still need planning permission. So I hope that's quite clear. Article 4 is very borough specific. Some boroughs have it, some boroughs don't have it, and it's important that you check it, and the way you check it is through Google. Now, going back to our example, so we've got, in 2021, there was no Article 4 direction in Brent. So now what I need to do is I need to find the license book. So the way I'm going to do that is so this is the conditions for mandatory/additional HMO licensing scheme. So this is a 35-page document, I should say, that essentially goes through all the requirements for us to design a compliant HMO. Going back to our rules checklist, we found our local authority, we found how many tenants, we've checked whether we need Article 4 or not, and now we've got the rule books, okay, which is the standards required for HMO licensing and planning. Okay. So the next thing we do now is we're going to understand the rule book, which is this 35-page document, and we're going to use this 35-page document to design our HMO. Another thing that's really important is that when we are designing our HMO, if you notice in this rule book, you've got things like tenancy management, antisocial behavior, deposit protection, rent payments, property management. We care more about, from a design perspective, conditions that's going to impact the material change of the property. So what that means is that, what rules are going to impact the actual construction of the property, and things and the things that are of most concern in that area are what's the kitchen requirements, what's the bathroom requirements, what's the space standards, and what's the fire risk standards that we need to adhere to. It's really important that we understand these, because this will directly first allow us to design our HMO compliantly, but it'll also then tell us what will be the cost of conversion in order for us to get a compliant HMO. So let's start designing our HMO. So this is kind of the floor plans for the 3-bedroom property. So if you have a look here, we've got the 3 bedrooms at the top. So you've got bedroom 1, 2, and 3. You've got a lovely living room here, and then an open plan dining kitchen area, utility area, and then we've also got two bathrooms. So the first thing we want to do is we want to first understand the kitchen requirements. So what I've actually done is I took the kitchen requirements from this document and I've turned it into a more digestible checklist, and with AI and tools, it's quite straightforward on how you can do that. So this is kind of all the information that I've gathered in this presentation is all from this original document. It's just that this document's quite hard to read, and so for ease of use and ease of explanation, I've turned them into these simpler checklists essentially, but the information is exactly the same. If we look at the kitchen facilities, it says here that we essentially have 1 set per 3 households or 5 people, whichever is less. So what that means is if we look at our property, we've only really got 1 set of kitchen facilities. A set of kitchen facilities is, cooker, sink, splashback, work surface, things like that. So because we've only got 1 kitchen facility and our restriction is, we don't want to go through planning, so we only want to have maximum 6 occupants. To get 6 occupants, we would need to fit a second set of kitchen facilities. Now, what I like to do when I'm designing the property is first try and create a HMO with the least amount of material changes. So I'm going to stick to just the 1 kitchen set, which then will restrict me to house 5 people instead of 6. So my maximum amount of people I can house is 5 people. That's done. The location must be one on the same floor or one floor away. So if we look at our, there's only 2 floors, so we meet that criteria. And then there's max 2 sets of kitchen facilities per room, which is irrelevant because we're not going to be installing a second set of kitchen facilities for now. And then there's also these rules kind of thing. So for each set, you'll need cooking facilities, so hobs, oven, grill, a sink, 1000 by 600 with hot and cold water and drainage, splashback, 300 millimeters of tile splashback, storage, 1 meter wide per person and 1.2 if it's a couple. Work surface, which is like your worktop, at least 1000 by 600, and then sockets and fridge, and that would kind of constitute a kitchen facility. Okay, so now we've kind of done the kitchen requirements. The next thing we want to do is understand the bathroom requirements. So looking at the bathroom requirements, what it essentially says is that we need 1 water closet for every 5 persons, I should say. 1 water closet for every 5. Then it says, by the way, we've got that because we've got 2. Then it says each water closet is in its own separate room, so it's not combined with the kitchen, which we have. Yeah. And at least half of the toilets are separate from the bathroom/shower areas. And this is quite interesting, right? Because it's basically saying that half of the toilets need to be separate from the shower areas. But then it's also saying, so let's go back here. So half, which is 1 WC, cannot be in the shower. So technically, we don't actually meet this because we've got 2 WCs, but they're all combined within the shower facilities. So this one is not getting met currently. Now, if we look at the bath and shower facilities though, over here it says here, there needs to be a bath or shower available for up to 5 people. So 1 bath per 5 people, which we do have. Then it says if a bath is provided, it meets the 1700 by 700. If a shower is provided, it meets 800 by 800. So we need to make sure that the shower and the bath meet the minimum requirements, which is 1700 by 700 for the bath and 800 by 800. And that's millimeters, by the way, for the shower. Now, what's really interesting though is because we are only renting the property out to 5 people, and we only require 1 bath per 5 people and 1 toilet per 5 people, and that half the amount of toilets, so basically all the toilets in the property cannot be within the shower. Well, what we can actually do is we actually meet that condition, because what we've got is we've got 2 toilets here. So let me do a different color. So you've got toilet here and shower here. So this space, the toilet and shower on the ground floor, meets the toilet and shower requirements because it's up for 5 people. However, where it says here, at least half of the toilets are separate, we've actually got another toilet on the first floor. So we actually do have 2 toilets. So technically, if we had 5 people, then we actually only just need 1 toilet, which is separate, and then 1 toilet that's within the shower facilities. And so actually, the extra bath and the shower is just extra. It's just extra facilities that we're providing for the tenants, essentially. So from a bathroom requirement and a kitchen requirement, if we were to go for up to 5 people, at the moment, we are meeting all these requirements. So no material changes at the moment. Next is space standards. So the first thing it says here is single occupancy, which is 1 person over 10 years old, is 6.51 square meters. And, double occupancy needs to be 10.2 square meters. So technically, the living room can house 2 people. Bedroom 1 can house 2 people. Bedroom 3 can house 2 people. And then bedroom 4 can only house 1 person, because it's less than 10.2, but it's more than 6.5. If bedroom 3 was less than 6.5, then it could house 0 people. So we meet those. And then single rooms need to be at least 1.8, and then double rooms need to be at least 2.3. However, we've now got 2, 4, 6, 7. But we only have facilities for 5. So actually, we can't actually house what we got 7, but we can only house 5. So that means the living room can only house 1 person. Bedroom 3 can only house 1 person. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then bedroom 1 maybe can only also house 1 person. So now if we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is now a compliant HMO. Now, looking at the kitchen space, the minimum kitchen size, at least 5.5 meters squared for one set of kitchen facilities, which we absolutely meet. We absolutely demolish because it's like we've got that huge space here. And then finally, it says here, if a communal space is provided, then it needs to be at least 11 square meters. Now, this is kind of where the loophole comes in, because with Brent, and this is very different depending on the councils, if you do not provide a living or communal area, then you do not adhere to the space standard, essentially. So this is only if you want to provide it. So if we were to keep this structure as is, then we would meet everything, because we would essentially have 5.5 for the kitchen facilities and 11 square meters for the living dining, which is this space over here. However, if we want to optimize our rent, at the moment we've got 4 bedrooms, and what I would say is generally it's 5 or more bedrooms, or 5 or 6 bedrooms ideally, that can get you that extra bit of profit. So what I decided to do, because I know that we don't actually need the communal space, what I decided to do is create a corridor like this, and then a partition here, where you'd have now the entrance to this bedroom through here, and then the entrance now into the kitchen would be, we'd open that wall up into the utility area. And so now, if you're a tenant here, you can go through the hallway, turn left, and now you're in that kitchen. But what's really important is, for this to work, is this kitchen now, which is this space here, needs to be greater than 5.5 square meters. If it's not greater than 5.5 square meters, then this doesn't work. But it luckily was greater than 5.5. So again, we're meeting all the space requirements here. But now, if you look at the amount of rooms we've got, is now we've got 1 room, 2 rooms, 3, 4, and 5 rooms. Where we had a couple that was staying in bedroom 2, I should say, we can only have 1 person staying there now, because remember, we need 5 occupants. And then for bedroom 2, we can also have 1. So now we've got a 5-bedroom HMO, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that essentially meets all the space standards of the single occupancy, double occupancy, meets the minimum kitchen sizes, and also meets the living and communal spaces with the if provided. It also meets the bathroom requirements and the kitchen requirements. So now that we've designed our HMO from the space standard, so now the next thing we want to do is think about fire risk, okay? So when you think of the fire alarm, so if we go back for a moment, when we're thinking about the kitchen requirements, bathroom requirements, space standards, your local council's HMO guide will be fine. But when you're looking at fire risk, outside of obviously speaking to a consultant, there is another document called the LaCourse Fire Regulation document. So if I go into the mandatory HMO license for a moment, and we go to fire safety, there will be a lot of information about fire safety in this document itself. However, if you look at it, it says here, in determining adequate fire precautions, reference should be made to the LaCourse guidance of housing fire safety. So this guide basically gives you everything you need to know about what fire safety requirements you require. And you can literally download it online. Boom, it's here. It's like an 80-page document. If you go into the case study section, they have loads of different case studies. So for us, we're on page 43, we're a bed-sit type HMO. Boom. And so then this basically tells you, this is for a shared house up to 2 stories. And then you've got all these different kind of variations. You've got single household, shared house 3 or 4 stories, shared house of 6 stories, bed-sit type HMO of 2 stories. So this basically, bed-sit type HMO is what we're kind of doing, because I'm renting by room. If I was renting to friends, then it would be a shared house. And then essentially you've got fire separation, fire detection, escape routes, all that information is in this document. So you should definitely be using this document. Obviously outside of that, you can speak to your local council officer, licensing officer, but this document's super helpful to understand the fire regs. So the first thing we want to do is escape route. So we need 30-minute fire protection. So what does that actually look like? What does that mean? So what is an escape route? Well, essentially, an escape route is the route that each occupant takes in case of a fire. So for bedroom 1, it would be outside and the front. There's only really one front exit, which is the fire exit. Bedroom 2 would be out the door, through the corridor, out the fire exit. And then for bedrooms 3, 4, and 5, it would be similar. They get out on the hallway, go down the stairs, and then get out of the property. So we need to make sure that this is 30-minute fire protection. So what that actually means is that when we're erecting this partition needs to make sure, we need to make sure that this partition is 30-minute fire protected, essentially, has the right partitions to be, has the right construction so that it is 30-minute fire protection. Next thing is the fire doors. So all habitable rooms need to have fire doors with smoke seals and self-closers. So each room, so this one, this one, this one. When we say habitable, it's really your kitchen and your bedrooms, not your bathrooms. These all require fire doors with smoke seals and self-closers. Self-closers are basically when you open the door will then swing back out. So that's a consideration. And then also you want to have thumb turns, which is each room will have their own locks, but they need to have thumb turns. And actually what I like to do is go for, because once you start having over 100 rooms, for example, handling keys can be quite long. So key code thumb turn locks. So you can go get something like this, which essentially is from the outside you have a code, and then from the inside it's a thumb turn, basically. The reason why thumb turns are super important is that in case of fire, you are able to kind of leave the room, essentially. So whilst they can lock from the outside, they should be openable inside without a key. So that's the locks. And then next, we want to do a fire alarm system. So we want smoke alarms. So we want basically mains wired smoke alarms in each, essentially along the escape routes and in the bedroom. So let's go for a blue. So we can put a smoke here. The smoke goes here. The smoke goes in here. The smoke goes in here. The smoke goes here. 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 So that's your smoke alarms. These smoke alarms need to be super important. They're mains wired, so they're connected to the mains wiring, and they're also battery operated in case the mains wiring goes off. But it's really important they're mains wired. Next, you have a mains wired heat detector, and that goes in the kitchen. So we've got that. In the kitchen, so that will be in the kitchen here. We can just put heat detector here. Then you've got emergency lights, okay, so along the escape routes. So as mentioned previously, our escape routes is pretty much this kind of the hallway through here, and then from the top you go down the stairs and then get to the front. There's only really one front exit, which is the front of the house. So here you want to put emergency lights along the escape route. So that will be, maybe we throw in an emergency light here. We throw an emergency light here in the hallway. And then we can also throw an emergency light maybe on the first floor. So we need 3 emergency lights which will light up the escape routes. And then finally we want firefighting equipment and signs. So we want heat blankets in the kitchen. So again, we can maybe throw in the heat blanket. Let's put the heat blanket over here. And then fire extinguisher, 1 per floor. So that's maybe 1 over here, and then maybe 1 over here. And then exit signs. So generally, as mentioned, if you can put
some exit signs, especially on the front fire exit door, and maybe along the route. This particular property is not that complicated. It's quite simple, so I don't think it's necessary. But definitely on the fire exit door, there should be a fire exit sign. And generally what I do is once I've kind of built this out, it's never a harm to kind of contact the council and just be like, look, this is what I'm thinking of doing. These are the precautions. And then they'll be really helpful. They'll give you, the council want you to be compliant. So they're fairly helpful when it comes to these things, especially when it's the first time doing the conversion and you're like a bit unsure what type of smoke alarm systems you need to install, depending on the size of the property. The council can be really, really helpful.
So next, once we've looked at the licensing rules and actually designed our compliant HMO, the next thing we want to do is actually evaluate the deal. We want to look at what was the cost of conversion. So what is the cost of turning this property into a HMO? And we also want to look at the rental analysis. So what sort of rental income are we looking at after expenses? And finally, we can kind of calculate whether this deal is worth doing or not. I like to use a term, I like to use a calculator called return on capital employed. And for me, essentially, that is comparing the extra money I am investing into this property to turn it into a HMO compared to the extra money that I am receiving in rent. So it's essentially a percentage term that will give me an indication whether the project is worth doing or not. So first, going through the cost of conversion, and by the way, I'll actually share the exact figures of how much it costed me to turn the 3-bedroom property into a HMO. But in terms of the process that I go through, when we're thinking of the cost of conversion, there are really 3 areas that I like to think about when I'm considering what the costs are going to be. So these are the aesthetics, so things like painting, flooring, furniture. This is really from an aesthetics perspective, how do I make my HMO more attractive than my competitors' HMOs, so I get better rents. The next will be space, bathroom and kitchen requirements. Is there any material changes that were required to the property to adhere to kind of the requirements that we mentioned earlier? And then finally, there is fire risk, which is essentially the fire doors, fire alarm systems, things like that, that we would need to carry out to make the property compliant from a fire risk perspective. So looking at the example that I'm kind of working us through, if we look at the kind of aesthetics, that's a pretty simple one. That was essentially just kind of the painting, the furniture and things of that nature. If we look at the space, bathroom and kitchen requirements, we didn't actually make any material changes. So if you look at the bathrooms, they stay the same. The kitchen actually stays the same, except there is now a new entrance that we've created, but that doesn't necessarily affect how many kitchens or if we were kind of installing a new kitchen. And then next we have fire risk. And this is probably one of the bigger changes. So as you can see with all the smoke alarms that I've dotted about, the heat detector in the kitchen, the emergency lights, all of these things are going to cost money. And this is really important to take into consideration. Also, the fire doors in all the habitable rooms, so that will be the kitchen and the bedrooms. This will also be a change that we will need to do, and there'll be a cost associated with this. So how much did this conversion actually cost? So one thing I should really mention is, again, when I'm looking at quotes, so this is the real figures of how much the conversion actually costs, but if I'm kind of evaluating the deal and I haven't started the HMO yet, well, the first thing I want to do is I want to break up the job by trade. And it's super important that we do this because of a couple of reasons. It's super easy to get quotes over the phone, because if you're calling a painter and you're saying, hey painter, I want you to give me a quote for painting a 5-bedroom house, for example, it's much easier to get an estimate over the phone than speaking to a contractor and you're saying, hey, I want to do this, I want to create fire doors, I want a fire alarm system, I want you to do the painting, the flooring. They have to actually come in, they have to analyze the whole deal. So if you want a real quick snapshot of how much this is going to cost, then I think understanding kind of splitting the job by trade and then giving each tradesman a call. So you can literally call 3 or 4 electricians, you can call 3 or 4 carpenters, you can call 3 or 4 painters, decorators, and then you can really quickly build out a rough estimate of how much this project is going to cost. And then finally, if you do go with a general contractor because you don't want to manage the project yourself, at least you have real figures to then negotiate the contractor by. So for instance, this contract, I actually was the one that managed the project, so I kind of hired subcontractors and it turned out to be £24,400. However, if I now had done all this research and then have a general contractor that comes to me and says this is going to cost £40,000, then I can really be like, hey, hang on, where's that extra, whatever, 15,000 or so pounds going? On the other side, if they come and say, hey, I can do it for you in £18,000, I'm like, well, this also doesn't add up. So it gives you a good negotiating power and gives you more understanding when you're negotiating with a general contractor. So looking at the costs now and coming back to the project that I did, if you look at the carpenter, which is £4,000, that's pretty much related to the partition to create bedroom 2, the access to the kitchen, and then also the fire doors. This is what the £4,000 was made up of. Next, we had the electrician, which was the fire alarm system, so the smoke alarms, the heat detectors. They also put in some sockets on the partition, and they also did some changes like changing the consumer unit. So this totaled to £2,700. Finally, this is a really large figure. The handyman cost was around 11,000, but a lot of this was actually the furniture, which for a project of this size, pretty much was half the project. This is kind of like the bed, the sofas. I like to try and go above and beyond in my room, so then I can provide the best value essentially. And so for us, we have a budget. I have a budget of around £1,500 per room, and so the biggest cost of this was pretty much the furniture. Then you have the painter decorator, which is essentially just painting, maybe some touch-ups here and there to make the place look nicer. We had cleaner costs, which is £600. We had skip costs, which is £700, and then we also have licensing, which is £1,400. That's like the HMO license, maybe a fire risk assessment, things of that nature. So the total cost of this project was £24,400. So what were the actual rents that we achieved? So bedroom 1, which is this bedroom over here, we achieved £950. Bedroom 2, which was the large bedroom that we created by creating the partition, we actually received we receive £1,100 for that. Bedroom 3, which is the smaller bedroom, we've got £760. Bedroom 4, which is the larger bedroom, we're getting £1,040. And then finally, bedroom 5, we're getting £925. So overall, the gross rent is £4,775. Now, let's say you don't know what the rents need to be. You have no clue about on how to measure what the rents are in your area when you're evaluating the deal. It's quite simple. What you do is you go onto a site called Spare Room. I'm sure you've probably heard of it. And then you just type in, let's say, Wembley, and then you'll have a bunch of rooms. You can also kind of look at whether it's furnished, whether it's an ensuite, whether it's a double or a single, and then you can have a look at specific kind of rooms that look similar to look similar to the rooms that you're looking to kind of give, and then you can estimate the cost of what your rooms will be based on a site like Spare Rooms. Again, looking at from my perspective, these are the rooms that I've actually already achieved. So this is kind of what we achieved for all 5. Then after you've kind of understood the gross rent, when you're renting by room, so these numbers are by room, generally as a managing agent or a landlord, you are responsible for handling the bills. And the bills in our case come up to anywhere between £1,200 and £1,400 per year, especially with the increase of cost of energy. So realistically, gas, electricity will set you back around £850. Now, this is a lot higher than if you were to give it to, for example, if you're living in a 5-bedroom property, or if you're living in a property of a similar size, you may think it's a lot higher, but generally, because it's individual tenants, there's just more usage. So I would definitely not compare a HMO energy usage to a single family house HMO usage. It just won't compare, basically. Yeah, so the estimated running costs are £1,366 for this particular property. We also do like weekly cleaning, and I've also added an additional maintenance budget. HMOs generally also require way more maintenance than a single family home. So the net rent will be £2,836. If you're self-managing, then you can add the extra £573 to that. But essentially, assuming that you're not self-managing, you're getting a managing agent to do this, then your net rent will be £2,836. And what would be the return on capital employed? So again, the return on capital employed is the additional rental income that we're getting from turning the property into a HMO. So if we were to not turn the property into a HMO and just rent the property out to a single family, then we would still need to do some works, changing the consumer units, maybe giving the property a new lick of paint, things of that nature. So the cost would still be maybe, if we were to rent out to a family, maybe between £3,000 to £4,000. But the rent would probably likely be net £1,900. And what I mean by net is you've got £2,200 of obviously the gross rent, £220 would be the management fee, and then £80 would be like a small management budget, a small maintenance budget, and that would be monthly. So if you were to run the property as a single family home, you would invest £4,000 and rent the property out at £2,200, assuming you're also managing the assuming that you are getting a management agent to manage the property, then your net rent would be £1,900. In comparison, investing to turn the property into a HMO was £24,400, and the net rent is £2,836. So the extra investment is £20,400, and the extra rent is £936 per month. So the return on capital here is around 55%, which essentially means that in 2 years you would get your extra £24,400 back, and then after that, after the third year, you would then exhibit profits. And this is obviously in an ideal case. Managing a HMO obviously has way more different rules, higher risk in terms of licensing and things like that, but in general, this would be the kind of calculations to go by. So yeah, I hope that was of interest.